The air in Silverton, Colorado, in January of 1884, did not feel like air. It felt like a cold, clear glass pressing against the skin. At 12,000 feet, the sky was a dark, brittle blue, and the mercury in the town's official thermometer, kept at the assay office, had burrowed into the bulb, useless. The spirit thermometer hanging outside the office of the Animas Forks Freight Company registered minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a cold that broke metal, that turned axle grease into sandstone, and that killed living things with quiet, structural finality. In the newly built high-sided pine barn owned by Elias Carter, 60 of the finest freight mules in the San Juans stood shivering, their breath freezing instantly into a fine, white powder that coated their muzzles. Despite 2 potbelly stoves roaring at full capacity, the interior of the barn was 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Carter was losing 2 mules a night. 3 miles up the valley, Silas Veblen's 40 mules were also standing in the dark, but they were not shivering. They were draped in a gentle steam, their coats damp in an atmosphere so stable it felt more like a cellar in spring than a barn in a record-breaking winter. Veblen was burning no firewood for heat. What did this quiet, solitary freighter understand about thermal physics that the most experienced mine operators and engineers in Colorado had completely missed? The year was 1884, and Silverton was not a town for the weak. It was an engine of extraction. A high-altitude island built on silver ore, connected to the world by nothing but steel rails and mule trails. The mules were the lifeblood. They were the tractors, the trucks, and the locomotives of the high peaks, hauling lumber, boilers, and food-up passes that horses refused, and bringing tons of silver-lead concentrate down. A prime Missouri mule cost $200, a staggering sum equivalent to half a year's wages for a laborer. Protecting this livestock was not sentiment. It was asset management. The conventional wisdom, brought from the Ohio valleys and the forests of New England, was clear: a proper barn. This meant a heavy timber frame, tall walls to promote airflow, double-planked sides for strength, and a vast open hayloft. The theory was that the hayloft provided insulation from above, while the tall, airy space below prevented the buildup of ammonia and respiratory sickness. The solution to cold, joined to the engineering manuals of the day, was mass and BTUs. Build thick, build tall, and if it gets cold, burn more wood. Elias Carter, the largest freight operator in the district, had followed this wisdom to the letter. Carter's barn was a monument to conventional thinking. Completed in October 1883 at a cost of $1,800, it was the pride of the valley. It measured 80 feet long by 40 feet wide, with a 20-foot-high roof peak. Its walls were constructed of 2 layers of 1-inch milled pine planks, separated by a 3-inch dead air space, believed to be the pinnacle of insulation. The foundation was stone. The hayloft above was packed 10 feet deep with Timothy hay, a massive thermal blanket. To combat the winter, Carter had installed 2 massive cast-iron round oak stoves, one at each end, which his stable hands fed with a combined quarter cord of piñon pine every 24 hours. But the design was fundamentally flawed. The sheer volume of the space, over 64,000 cubic feet, was impossible to heat. The stoves created localized hotspots, while the vast, uninsulated surface area of the walls, over 4,800 square feet, bled heat into the minus 55-degree air. The dead air space in the walls was not dead. It was actively convecting, pulling heat from the inner plank and transferring it to the outer. The stable hands reported that the mules would crowd the stoves, sweating on one side while freezing on the other, inevitably catching pneumonia. Condensation from the animal's breath froze 6 inches thick on the north wall. Carter was practicing active heat generation, fighting a losing war against the physics of convective and conductive heat loss. He had lost 12 mules by the first week of January, a loss of $2,400. Silas Veblen was not an engineer, nor a wealthy operator. He was an ex-Army scout who had spent 5 years in the Dakota Territory, provisioning forts in winters that rivaled Colorado's. He had come not with capital, but with observation. In the Dakotas, He had watched the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes survive polar winds not in tall wooden structures, but in earth lodges, semi-subterranean dwellings whose brilliance lay in their humility. He had seen bison take shelter from blizzards not by standing behind trees, but by bedding down in hollows and drifts. Veblen had also worked briefly as a mule skinner in the anthracite mines of Pennsylvania. He understood two principles that Elias Carter did not. First, wind is the true enemy, as it steals heat geometrically. Second, the Earth itself, just a few feet below the frost line, is a massive thermal battery, one that never drops below 45 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. When Veblen arrived in Silverton, he didn't buy a lumber contract. He bought 24 shovel heads and cases of blasting powder. He was ridiculed. As Carter's magnificent barn was being framed, Veblen was seen digging into the side of a south-facing hill, like a man digging a root cellar. Carter himself had offered Veblen a job, pitying the man's apparent poverty. "Veblen," he'd said, "you can't keep mules in a hole. They'll rot from the damp." Veblen just nodded and kept digging. Veblen's first implementation was not a barn, it was a shelter. He chose his site with geologic care, a steep, south-facing slope of shale and gravelly soil, which offered excellent drainage and maximum solar exposure. He used a team of hired laborers, paying them in freight credit, to excavate a massive cut-and-cover trench. The final interior space measured 100 feet long and 30 feet wide, but it was only 9 feet high. He was minimizing the air volume he had to manage. He lined the excavated earth walls not with pine, but with thick, 10-inch diameter timbers of salvaged spruce, stacked horizontally like a log cabins, creating a crib wall. This was purely structural. The roof was the critical component. Veblen laid 12-inch beams across the 30-foot span, covering them first with a tight layer of willow branches, then a foot-thick layer of packed straw for insulation, and finally, 3 full feet of the excavated sod and earth. The total cost was under $200, mostly for the timbers and the labor. The only exposed face was the south-facing front, which he walled with double-thick timbers, packing the gap between them with manure and straw. The single 8-foot-wide door was a heavy, quilted mat of canvas and wool scraps. To the casual observer, it looked like a mine entrance or a primitive dugout, a sign of poverty and desperation. The conflict between the two structures was a conflict of philosophies. Carter, representing the industrial age, believed in overpowering nature. His was a philosophy of active force. Build thick walls, burn more fuel, generate more heat than the outside world can steal. It was a brute force equation of BTUs. Veblen, representing an older, more observational knowledge, believed in accommodation. His was a philosophy of passive retention. Do not fight the cold. Hide from it. Do not generate new heat. Trap the heat that already exists. He was not trying to heat a 64,000 cubic foot box from 5 degrees to 40 degrees. He was simply trapping the body heat of 41,000-pound mules, each a 3,000 BTU per hour furnace, inside a small 27,000 cubic foot space. His primary enemy was not the 55-degree temperature. It was heat loss. By burying the barn, he eliminated 90% of the structure's exposed surface area. The remaining surface, the earth walls and ceiling, was not losing heat to 55-degree air. It was interfacing with 45-degree soil. The ground was not a cold sink. It was a heat source, or at least a thermal stabilizer. The first vindication came not from a blizzard, but from a neutral observer. Dr. Aris Thorne, a geologist for the San Juan Mining Association, was also a meticulous amateur meteorologist tasked with keeping regional weather logs. In mid-December, on a relatively mild day of 10 degrees Fahrenheit, he visited Carter's barn. His thermometer read 28 degrees near the center. The air was acrid with smoke and ammonia. The animals were restless. He then visited Veblen's dugout, as the town called it, expecting a damp, foul-smelling cave. He had to bend to enter the low, insulated doorway. Inside, the air was warm. He wrote in his log, "A wave of damp, animal-scented air met me, but it was not foul. Lanterns hung from the beams. The animals were quiet, some lying down, a rare sight in winter. The earth walls were cool but not frozen. The ceiling was damp, but not dripping. He hung his thermometer. After 10 minutes, it stabilized at 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Veblen was burning no fuel for heat. Furthermore, Veblen's feed ledgers showed his mules were consuming 15% less hay and oats than Carter's. They were not burning calories simply to maintain their core temperature. Veblen's system was a sophisticated 4-part thermal engine. The first layer was the thermal mass, the surrounding 50-degree earth that acted as a giant, stable radiator, constantly moderating the interior temperature. The second layer was the insulation, the 3 feet of sod and straw on the roof, which prevented heat from escaping upwards. A 10-foot snowdrift, which Veblen allowed to build up over the roof, only improved this R value. The third layer was the heat source, the 40 mules themselves, collectively generating over 120,000 BTUs per hour, more than enough to warm the well-insulated space. But the fourth layer was the true genius, the component that defeated Carter's complaint of rot. Veblen had engineered a passive ventilation system. At the far uphill end of the barn, he had dug a 12-inch square vertical shaft, the flue, which rose 20 feet to the open air. Because the 52-degree air inside the barn was lighter and more buoyant than the 10-degree or 55-degree air outside, a natural and constant stack effect was created. Warm, moist air, laden with ammonia and carbon dioxide, rose gently and exited the flue. This, in turn, created negative pressure, which slowly drew fresh, cold air in through a small straw-filtered intake pipe Veblen had placed near the door. The system exchanged the air completely every 6 hours, slow enough to retain the heat, but fast enough to keep the animals healthy. It was a self-regulating, self-powered climate system. The true test came with the Great Freeze of January 1884. For 3 days, the temperature never rose above 40 degrees, and the wind, blowing from the north at 60 miles per hour, created wind chill factors that defied calculation, snapping 100-year-old pines in half. At Carter's barn, the fight was lost on the first night. The 2 stoves, consuming wood at a frantic rate, simply could not combat the convective heat loss. The wind forced 55-degree air through every crack in the planking. The north wall's interior became coated in a foot of ice. The stable hands, fearing for their own lives, could not make the quarter-mile trip to the woodpile. By the second morning, the stoves were out. The temperature inside the barn plummeted to 20 degrees. The mules, unable to move, began to freeze where they stood. Inside Veblen's dugout, the world was silent. The 15-foot snowdrift that had buried his barn and covered the roof acted as a perfect wind-proof blanket. Veblen and his one stable hand, a Ute man named Charlie Begay, sat by a lantern playing cards. The mules were calm. The only sound was the steady, low draw of air through the ventilation flue. Dr. Thorne, who later verified Veblen's log, confirmed the temperature inside the dugout never dropped below 46 degrees Fahrenheit. When the storm broke on the 4th day, Veblen and Begay had to tunnel 20 feet up through the snow to get out. They emerged into a frozen, silent world. A rescue party, organized at the assay office, found Elias Carter and his men suffering from severe frostbite, huddled in the feed room. Of Carter's 60 mules, only 14, those clustered in the center, had survived. Veblen had not lost a single animal. The human impact was immediate. Carter was ruined, his freight contracts forfeit. The mines, unable to ship ore or receive supplies, were threatening to shut down, which would have killed the town. Veblen's 40 mules were the only operational draft animals left in the Animas district. He held a complete monopoly on freight, but he did not exploit it. His first act was to send his mules, led by Charlie Begay, on rescue runs, hauling food and wood to the outlying claims and checking on prospectors. He then took his teams to Carter's barn and hauled the frozen carcasses away for burial, charging Carter nothing. Humbled, Elias Carter went to Veblen's dugout, hat in hand. He was not there to ask for a loan, but for a job. Veblen put him to work managing the feed. The dugout became the temporary town hall, a warm, stable place where Dr. Thorne and the mine foreman could meet to plan the town's survival. They sat on hay bales in the 50-degree air, surrounded by the quiet shuffling of healthy animals, and planned the excavation of 2 new, larger subterranean shelters to be managed by Veblen and funded by the mining consortium. Dr. Thorne's subsequent report, a technical analysis of subterranean shelters for the preservation of livestock in high-altitude environments, was published in the Mining and Scientific Press, and copies were sent to the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. The data was irrefutable. Carter's Barn, 80,000 board feet of pine, $1,800 cost, 12-day fuel cost, in full winter, 76% animal loss. Veblen's Shelter, 3,000 board feet of cull timber, $200 cost, $0 fuel cost, 0% animal loss. The report was a sensation among engineers and military men in the West. The Veblen dugout, as it came to be known, was not mocked. It was copied. By the winter of 1885, the hillsides around Silverton, and soon after Telluride and Cripple Creek, were dotted with these low, sod-roofed structures, each identified by its small, steaming ventilation flue. Lumber merchants saw their sales of high-grade pine for barns collapse, replaced by a booming market for structural spruce timbers and blasting powder. Years later, Silas Veblen's innovation had permanently altered the architecture of the high frontier. The tall, proud New England barn all but vanished from the high Rockies, seen as a decadent and foolish liability. The landscape was now defined by structures that embraced the earth, rather than defying it. The technical lesson was profound. In an environment of extreme thermal scarcity, efficiency is not about better generation, but about radical conservation. Veblen had not invented a new stove. He had redefined the wall. He recognized that in a place where the air was a mortal enemy, the only logical ally was the ground beneath his feet. He had not built a structure on the land. He had merged his structure with the land, and in doing so, had saved the economic engine of an entire region.